I'll go first. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's such a joy to be here with you at Soneva Fushi with JLF in its first incarnation. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to be talking with Ben Macintyre about Operation Mincemeat. And those of you who are here, I think on Tuesday night, is it, or Monday night? Tuesday night.
Monday night, I think, yeah.
We'll be watching a film that's just been released about Operation Mincemeat. So I'm going to ask Ben the first question, which is, what role do you play in the film of your book?
Actually, in the film, not at all. I was quite involved in the making of the film, which was extraordinarily good fun. In fact, they practically had to throw me off set by the end of it. I was executive producer of the film, and when I asked them what that actually meant, they said, well, what that means is you can come on set and you can say things like, that's the wrong kind of hat, and we will ignore you. Which I thought was a pretty good deal for the money. It was fine. I absolutely loved it. It's very strange, though, seeing your book turned into a drama, because, of course, they have to drop large parts of it. It's a complicated story, Operation Mincemeat, and then they have to create a kind of emotional core to it that is obviously imagined. But well, we'll see what you think if you see the film on Monday, but I think they've done a brilliant job of maintaining the essential accuracy of the story while giving it this sort of romantic central heart. It's rather remarkable. It's an extraordinary film, really, because it's both an adventure story and a spy story and a war story and a love story and a comedy. I mean, bits of it are absurd, but anyway, we can talk about that. But yes, so do come to the film on Monday.
Well, it's not often that books get made into Hollywood blockbusters starring some of the Oscar winners and so on. So Ben is extremely modest. The process of getting these films made is hard, but I know that if I was ever in that position, I'd insist on being in the film alongside Colin Firth. But Operation Mincemeat is one of the most famous bluff operations in the history of warfare. So just start, I think, by setting the scene. Tell us, what is the context of the Second World War when people are sitting around trying to think of ways of getting a competitive advantage? What is going on in the late 1930s, early 1940s that getting British intelligence to think about bluff or spoof operations?
Well, the British were actually very good at this stuff. I think it's a sort of natural national kind of talent for deception, really. We're really good at lying with a completely straight face. It's one of the things we do best. And Churchill, very early on in the war, realized that if you can deploy what he called corkscrew mines, so he believed that if you put the right combination of slightly odd people together, and he was absolutely right, that you can produce a different kind of warfare. And we may talk about this later, but I mean, if you're anyone looking at what's happening in Ukraine today, it is clear that smoke and mirrors, false flags, deception operations, fake news, that's the backdrop of that war. And it was undoubtedly the hidden backdrop of the Second World War as well. I'll come on to Operation Mincemeat in a moment. Without the British government in about 1996 began to release the intelligence files relating to Operation Mincemeat. These are MI5 files. So MI5 is the internal security organisation of the UK. MI6 is the external espionage organisation. MI6 never releases its files. MI5 started to release them in 1995. And the Mincemeat files, and I'm not exaggerating, stand about that high. There's something like 8,500 pieces of paper. And what makes them very special is that they were never intended to be read by anybody outside the magic circle of those that produced it. And so they're honest in a way that most government files aren't. Most government files are intended to give a certain impression of what happened, and often a misleading one. The wonderful thing about the Operation Mincemeat files is that they tell you in almost minute-by-minute detail what was actually happening. And they don't make it up either. So when it goes wrong, they actually write in the margins of these pieces of paper, we're going to hell in a handcart here, this isn't going to work. And so you do get some of the sort of human warp and weft. So, sorry, the question you asked was about context. So we're in 1943. The invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe is about to happen. The Allied armies are massed in North Africa. This huge, the biggest armada the world had ever seen, was preparing to try to force the Nazis out of Europe. So everyone knew the invasion was coming. The Germans knew it was coming. The Italians knew it was coming. Obviously, the British and American and Canadians all knew it was coming. The question was, where was it going to land? Where was this huge sort of fleet of ships going to make land? And the obvious place to attack was Sicily. Because Sicily, in the middle of the Mediterranean, if you could control Sicily, you controlled the airspace around the whole of the Mediterranean. So as Churchill said, any bloody fool with an atlas can work out where this is going to happen. So the job of the corkscrew thinkers, if you like, was to try to persuade the Germans that instead of landing in Sicily, this huge number of troops, 160,000 men, were actually aiming for Greece in the eastern Mediterranean and Sardinia in the west. And so that's the core of Operation Mincemeat. And there was actually a massive deception operation surrounding it, of which Operation Mincemeat was the sort of central plank, if you like.
Well, so Ben is incredibly versatile, as readers of today's Times newspaper will know, when, in fact, Ben's written an article about false flags in the context of the Ukrainian war, amongst other things. And those of you who've been following the war will have seen things like the Ghost of Kiev, the so-called super pilot who's been shooting down Russian planes. These things are not unusual. It did make me laugh when you said the British are extremely good at lying, which I'm much too diplomatic to comment on, although I will tell you that in all my discussions with people who work on Iranian foreign policy, they're convinced that things like Brexit, the Ukraine war, are all part of some giant British plot to overthrow the world, that the Brits really think strategically and have some plan. But tell us, just before we go into Mincemeat itself, tell us about the Trout Memo and about how the context is getting all these kind of corkscrew weirdos. I'm not going to compare it to JLF, where you bring brilliant people together who are very different and ask them to create magic. That's for another discussion.
It's exactly the same.
Tell me about who are these people, how are they brought together, what are they trying to... It sounds easy, have crazy ideas. Yeah. What's the structure of those kinds of groups?
Well, one of the more extraordinary discoveries in the Mincemeat files was the role played in this whole story by Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, who was at that time assistant to the Director of Naval Intelligence, Admiral Sir John Godfrey, who would become the model for M in the James Bond stories. So there is this whole story is about the strange interplay between fact and fiction. So it starts with Ian Fleming, who drew up with Admiral Godfrey, right at the beginning of the war, a list of 58 ideas, ways to bamboozle the enemy. And they called it the Trout Memo. And it was called the Trout Memo because Admiral Godfrey was a great trout fisherman. And he compared deception to fly fishing, where you have to drop the fly as close as you possibly can in a deceptive way near the fish, and you have to play the fish. And number 28 on this list was headed by Ian Fleming, a suggestion, brackets, not a very nice one, in which he said, why don't we get hold of a dead body, drop it somewhere where the Germans will find it, make it look as if it was a soldier who died in an air crash, and we'll equip him with false papers, and if we can get that into the hands of the enemy, a dead courier is more believable than a live courier. And so let's make this the core. But even more bizarrely, Ian Fleming had also got this idea from another novelist, a man called Basil Thomson. No one ever reads Basil Thomson now. He was a really bad detective writer in the 1930s. But Ian Fleming was a huge fan, and he had all the collections. And in one of his books, literally, I think about 4 people have read this book, still alive, called The Milliner's Hat Mystery. There is a body is given a completely false identity. So the whole thing starts as fiction. And this idea was picked up by a man by the name, well, 2 men really. One was called Charles Chumley, and the other was called Ewan Montague. Now, what happened to all the people called Chumley and Montague? I mean, this story is peopled by people with mad names
and like Godfrey.
That. And Godfrey, and then the unrepeatable Sir Bentley Purchase, but we'll come to him in a second. But so Chumley read the Trout Memo and said, well, look, why don't we do this? And he presented it to something called the 20 Committee. Now, the 20 Committee was so called because 20 in Roman numerals is 2 X's. So it's the double cross committee. That's the kind of joke they liked. Okay, so the Double Cross Committee was responsible for feeding misinformation to the enemy, and he presented it to them. And initially it was completely rejected. They said, this is absolutely absurd. You can't do it, it's much too dangerous. And it was particularly Godfrey, actually, who, even though it was partly his idea, who said, if you do this, it's not just a tactical deception, it's a strategic deception. And if the Germans rumble that it's a lie, they're going to work out that it must be Sicily. Therefore, they'll reinforce Sicily, and those soldiers will land on the beaches and they will be annihilated. So right from the beginning, they realized it was an enormous gamble. But nonetheless, they got, partly because of Churchill's personal intervention, Montagu and Cholmondeley, and Ewan Montagu was a barrister, was a lawyer, so he knew a fair bit about lying, and he so between Cholmondeley and Montagu, they set about trying to find. Well, the first thing they had to do was to find a dead body, which.
Well, tell us about that, because you can't find those easily, but you have to find the right kind of dead body.
Well, that was the problem. It had to be a body that appeared to have drowned at sea or to have died in an air crash. Now, you'd have thought in the middle of the most bloody war of the 20th century, actually finding a body should have been quite easy. But it turned out to be extremely difficult because all the bodies they could find were either the wrong gender or the wrong shape, or they'd been killed in the wrong way. So we're now getting... The invasion is set for July 1943. In February 1943... Montagu, who, as I said, was a lawyer, contacted his old friend, who was the coroner of St Pancras, who went by the name of Sir Bentley Purchase. And Montagu approached him and said, we need a body. And completely illegally, Bentley Purchase called him up one day and said, I think I've got the right candidate here. And what they had done, it's actually a tragic story, and again, it was never revealed until these files were revealed, but the body of a homeless Welshman, a Welsh vagrant called Glyndwr Michael, had been found in a warehouse in King's Cross. And he had been poisoned by rat poison. Now, we've never known whether he did that deliberately or whether he was just so hungry that he ate bread laced with rat poison in this warehouse. But he died, and the body was unclaimed. That was critical. They believed there was no family involved, so they could just steal the body. So that's what they did. They lifted. Well, first of all, they also had to consult a man, again, a marvelous name, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who was he was a sort of chief forensic pathologist in Britain. He knew more about dead bodies than anybody else alive, and they consulted him and said, look, if this body is found by the Germans, will they be able to tell that he didn't drown, that he was poisoned? And Sir Bernard Spilsbury said, no, in order to do that, there would have to be a coroner in Spain who is as good as I am, and there aren't any. So he was totally wrong, by the way, because in fact the body, they would have been able to identify the poison, and there were some no, I haven't explained Spain, by the way. The body had to be dropped in Spain because the Brits had worked out there was a particular spy network, a German spy network, operating on the coast of Spain. Spain was neutral, of course, in the war, but it was stuffed with spies, British and Germans, this kind of secret spy war taking place. And they identified a particular spy who was operating in Huelva. And they believed that if they could get the body and the false documents, well, more importantly, the false documents, into his hands, there was a good chance that these would go all the way up the German high command and land eventually on Hitler's desk. So the target is Spain.
So one of the things about your book, which is which is available after the show, and I think you're doing autographs, signatures for Absolutely. The same price, all included, right?
Oh, it's all included.
One of the things is it all sounds great. It sounds incredible. I mean, literally, it sounds incredible that this is involving people right at the top of British intelligence, right up to the Prime Minister himself. But the level of detail to go into to prepare this body, it's not just find a dead man whose body can't get claimed by a relative and open up legal problems and to drop him in the sea with a briefcase. You've got to think through all those stages, and the level of detail is absolutely staggering. Tell us about how they take this corpse and make it look like it is absolutely spot on.
Well, as I said at the beginning, it's about the interplay between fact and fiction. And Montagu and Cholmondeley, in addition to Fleming, Montagu and Cholmondeley were also frustrated novelists. They wanted to write fiction, and so they set about creating what you call in spy parlance a legend for this character that had a complete backstory. So they believed that in order for the Germans to believe it, the body had to have a personality. It had to be somebody. So they had to invent somebody. So they invented Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They turned this dead Welsh tramp into somebody completely different. They gave him, by the way, he's now on ice. So the clock is ticking. He's not in deep freeze because you can't put a body in deep freeze and defrost it without it being obvious. So he's very slowly, not to put too fine a word on it, he's slowly rotting in Bentley Purchase's fridge. Okay, so the clock is ticking. They have to get this body to Spain before it literally falls apart. Okay, so they then set about it like novelists. They set about constructing a story to go around William Martin of the Royal Marines. So they gave him a bank manager, a letter in his wallet from the bank manager. They gave him a father.
An angry bank letter.
An angry bank manager and a grumpy father. Writing to him from the Black Lion Hotel in Mould. I mean, they went to such detail. They then also decided that in order for it to be a believable story, and this is where they went slightly over the top, actually. I mean, quite a lot of it was unnecessary. But in what is known in spy parlance as wallet litter. Wallet litter is the stuff that all of you have in your pockets that say who you are, that give little clues away about who you are. And of course, it was a very literate time, so he had to have letters. And the central element of it was to provide a girlfriend for him. So they invented Pam. Pam, needless to say, did not exist, but there was a photograph of Pam pressed to his wallet, which was in fact a photograph of one of the secretaries in MI5 called Jean Leslie. Now, I don't want to give away too much of the story, but Jean, who I knew, and I interviewed Jean, she was in her late 80s when I interviewed her. And she was utterly wonderful. And every time I asked her, because there's a romantic story in the middle of all of this, which I don't want to give away too much about. But
Ben, come on, we can't. You've got to give us a bit. We're all going to watch the film. Everyone's going to buy the book. We're going to buy the book, right? Yeah, we're all going to buy the book.
All right, I'll give it away. I'll give it away. So it was pretty clear to me, and I asked Jean about this, that there was a relationship between her and Ewan Montagu going on. So beneath the surface, they begin to start playing the parts of the people that they're inventing. And so Montagu begins writing to Jean Leslie in the character of William Martin of the Royal Marines. And she replies as if she were Pam. And into their 70s, they were writing to each other as Bill and Pam. And I asked Jean, I asked her many times, in fact, I wheeled her down to the bit on the Thames where this photograph had been taken, and I said, come on, Jean, come on, you clearly had an affair with Montagu. And she was wonderfully English, she said, oh, don't be so silly. In a way that made you realise that, of course, she had. And yes, so they became completely invested in the fiction they were creating.
So I'm not going. We are going to get to what happens with Operation Mincemeat, but I think probably most people will have guessed that it turns out to be relatively successful, right? So, but we won't get there quite yet. But a lot of did the people preparing all this stuff, going through the level of detail of theatre tickets that show the right date and the kind of all the wallet litter that is in huge detail. You know, you've got to have the right wallet litter. If you've only got fancy posh stuff, you've also got a lot of crap in your wallets too. Yeah. Did they really think that this was going to work? I mean, it's a lot of resource to plug into some harebrained scheme where if the current went in the wrong direction or the winds didn't work or the person who found him, you know,
well,
did they think it was going to work?
In truth, I think they didn't realise how well it was going to work until it began to work. The way they could, we're jumping ahead a bit here, but the way they could tell whether it was working or not was because they had the Bletchley Park intercepts. So they were able to read through the Enigma code what the German Abwehr, German military intelligence, was thinking. So they could follow it from moment to moment. And there is, in retrospect, funny, but at the time, terrifying moment when they began to realize that it was actually working much better than they expected it to, and they'd made some mistakes. There were elements in that wallet litter that were wrong. Notably, as you mentioned, the ticket stubs. If they tracked it back, those ticket stubs could not have been genuine. And so there were various sort of hostages to fortune built into the thing. And I think they hoped it was going to work, but they began to panic when they realized just how high the stakes were.
Okay, well, let's talk through mincemeat as it goes into play. But just as an aside, because I'll forget to ask it, were the British worried that there'd be leaks from the inside, that they had to keep the network very close and that people didn't know? Were they worried? Was German intelligence good enough to be a worry in Britain and in London that people might hear about this and leak information back?
They were fairly confident that there were no German spies excuse me, in Britain. I mean, they had reason to believe, because of the intercepts, the Bletchley Park work, they were pretty sure that there was no German spy operating in Britain, with one exception. We're going on a theme here. There was one spy whose identity has never been fully explained, and he went by the unimprovable name of Engelbertus Fucken. And his body was found in a bunker in Cambridge, and he was a Nazi parachute spy, and nobody's ever been able to work out how Engelbertus Fucken got into the country. But apart from him, they believed it was watertight. They believed there was no way that they were, but they couldn't be certain.
Okay.
They absolutely couldn't be certain. And what's more, particularly in Spain, once the body got to Spain, and of course the secret had to be shared with diplomats in Spain in order to make it work, they were much less confident about Spain. So there was huge jeopardy here, and as I said at the beginning, had it been rumbled, I mean, there was one moment in the deception when they began to fear that although it looked as if the Germans were believing it, that itself might be a ruse. So stay with me here. So in the wilderness of mirrors, they were fearful that the information they were getting from Germany indicating that it looked like it was working might itself be a deception, might itself be the biggest deception the Germans had ever played back on the Brits. So right up until the moment when they land on the shores of Sicily, they couldn't be sure that it was really going to work.
I mean, you couldn't make it up. I mean, it's such a wonderful story that you tell so well, Ben, in the book. To take us then to the body, was where we left it. Is it dropped in by air, by sea? How do they decide what they should do? And take us through to how it gets from Wellver up to the Germans.
Well, so the body, Glyndwr Michael, now William Martin of the Royal Marines, was carrying a briefcase. The briefcase was chained to his...
Why a briefcase? Why?
Well, they realized that they had to somehow get the documents, the false documents, and they again are another whole story, drafting up documents that would be sufficiently believable without being obvious. Turned out to be an absolute nightmare. I mean, they went through 14 different drafts before they worked out that a couple of informal letters would hint hard enough without being too obvious that there was going to be this invasion in Greece and another one in Sardinia. So the briefcase, he had to be able to carry something with him. There were quite a lot of documents, so he had to look like a courier. He had to look like somebody who was on official business. And what's more, they had to be sure that the briefcase would stay with him. So they chained it to his arm. Now, that again was a kind of hostage to fortune, because actually military couriers didn't do that. Bank clerks did that, carried things around chained to their wrists. But a proper investigation would probably have worked out that actually there was something rather odd about the fact that this thing was going to be chained to him. Nonetheless, they decided it was the only way they could do it. They had to get hold of waterproof inks to make sure that the stuff didn't wash off in the sea. And as Churchill said, only someone planning to drown would use waterproof ink. So they had to get a special kind of believable waterproof ink that was secretly waterproof without, I wouldn't give it away, So they took the body, they slightly refined it, and initially the idea was that they were going to drop it from a plane so that it looked as if he died in an air crash, and that was the whole idea. But in truth, by this point, the body of Glyndwr Michael was so far gone that had you dropped it from a plane, it would have just disintegrated. And so they took it by submarine. They put him into a torpedo tube, and they loaded him onto HMS Seraph, which was a sort of fighting tactical submarine. And it was taken, but the only person on the submarine was the captain who knew about the plot, was the captain, Bill Jewell. And they took it to the coast of Huelva, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, on a June day, they released the body into the water without any certainty of what was going to happen to it. I mean, they weren't even sure that the tides would really take it ashore. And that was it. So for the next 6 weeks, they were completely blind. Not quite, because they had the Abwehr intercepts, but they really didn't have a clue of what was happening.
But the body does get fished out of the water by a fisherman, and then what happens? What's the sequence that gets information to the Germans, and how high up into the German ranks does that go?
Well, it starts going wrong pretty much immediately. They're aiming to... The particular spy they had in mind was a man called Adolf Klaus, who was a highly efficient espionage figure on the coast of Huelva. And they began to drop hints that they were desperate. So through official... they knew that the British embassy in Madrid was bugged by the Germans. And so they began to they began to send messages that they knew were being intercepted by the Germans, saying, we've lost this really, really important package of documents, we need to get it back. Above all, don't let it fall into the hands of the Spanish police, because if the Spanish police get hold of it, they're in the pockets of the Germans, and if the Germans get it, we're all in trouble. So please get this briefcase back, knowing that the Germans would read it, and therefore think, oh, we'd better get hold of that briefcase. But it didn't really work, because one of the things they hadn't counted on was that Spain was neutral, and it was the naval authorities that actually picked up the body. And the first thing they did was offer to return the briefcase, which of course was exactly what the British didn't want. So the rather brilliant consul, a man called Gomez Bear in Britain, said to the naval authorities that I think we'd better stick to protocol here. It's a shame, but I think we'd probably better let it go through natural channels. I mean, it was all complete play acting, really. So, yeah, so the briefcase, and this is the extraordinary thing about Operation Mincemeat, is you can track the progress of this lie as it is swallowed, hook, line and sinker, as Churchill said it. You can follow it going down the gullet of German intelligence. And it's an extraordinary thing to pick up these documents and actually see them in real time being believed. But there's another element to this, which is that the head of German intelligence, the head of military intelligence, the man responsible for telling Hitler what to believe and what not to believe, was an anti-Nazi plotter. His name was Alexis von Röhne. He's a most mysterious figure. He was brilliant. He was killed by Hitler after the July plot. He was deeply involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler. And there is a decent chance that he was the person who looked at this range of documents. And don't forget, we've also got Pam's photograph and the love letters and the bank manager's details. So von Röhne is looking at this stuff, and he's responsible for assessing it. What is so extraordinary about von Röhne is that he didn't just tell Hitler to believe it, he actually exaggerated its importance. He went out of his way to make it seem even more believable than it really was. So there's a possibility that, in fact, one of the keys to Operation Mincemeat working was an anti-Hitler plot inside German intelligence.
And do you think that would have been him on his own, clocking and working out, it didn't quite stack up, but here was an opportunity and there was no benefits?
We don't know. I mean, we don't know why he did it. He clearly did exaggerate it. Maybe he was trying to just curry favor with Hitler. Maybe he genuinely believed it was true. Or maybe he just wanted it to be true while knowing that it wasn't. And that's the play in the whole story, is about whether something is actually true or whether we believe it to be true because that's what we want.
And does Röhne make it into the film?
Absolutely. Von Röhne is a key figure in the film. Tantalizingly, when the book came out, I got a call from a man in Paris saying, I am von Röhne's nephew, and I have his papers, and I would like to meet you and talk to you about this thing. This was a telephone message that was left for me. I rang that number 15 times. I never found him. He never reappeared. So there is a mystery there that one day I'll track him down, but he's gone to Earth. I can't find him.
Amazing. So I'll do a few more minutes and then we'll do some questions. I mean, it's just so extraordinary. So this body is found. The documents find their way into German agents who figure there's something important. Perhaps exaggerated to try to help cover over some of the cracks. But it goes right into the heart of German military intelligence and right up to Hitler himself, which is sort of extraordinary. So tell us about, once the documents do get opened, where do they get relayed up to and how high up the German high command?
They go all the way to the top.
All the way.
I'm not exaggerating, they literally end up on Hitler's desk. They end up right in front of him. The only person, in German high command who was not convinced by this was Goebbels. Goebbels read it, and Goebbels, despite, was one of the nastiest humans that has ever existed, but he was very clever. And he also, he understood, and this is a slight truism of intelligence, that if something looks perfect, if every detail fits together, it's probably a lie. And Goebbels, who was a sort of strangely a kind of Anglophile, he read the Times every day, he thought he understood the British mind. He looked at this and said, there's something smelly about this. This doesn't quite fit what we want to believe, what we think is going to happen. But Hitler was utterly convinced. It's also another element of deception that if you're trying to lie to someone, it's best to tell them something they already want to believe. And they knew through intelligence intercepts that Hitler was very worried about the Balkans, that he feared an invasion in Greece. He feared an invasion everywhere. And so in a way, they were pushing on a slightly open door. Even though it would look geographically obvious that it would have to be Sicily, they knew that Hitler was uncertain. And it was spectacularly successful. It is really no exaggeration to say that Operation Mincemeat was probably the most successful military deception, certainly of the Second World War, possibly of all time. Because not only did Hitler not reinforce the obvious target, Sicily, he drew troops away from Sicily. He redeployed them from Sicily to Greece and to Sardinia. So at the very least, the German defences were dissipated. And when the Sicilian invasion happened, it wasn't a walkover. It was, the Italians were still there on the coastal batteries, but it was nothing like what it would have been had Operation Mincemeat not happened.
And even after the invasion of Sicily, he kept troops in the Eastern Mediterranean, kept Rommel out in Greece, because he was sure that a second wave was going to come.
Absolutely. It's fascinating, isn't it, that also that happened at D-Day, which was also covered by another very complicated deception. Even when it became clear that they got it wrong, the Germans refused to kind of believe that they could have got it that badly wrong. They just decided, they must have changed their minds at the last moment. So they kept waiting in Greece and in Sardinia for an invasion that never happened. That tied up thousands of German troops.
So this information reaches Hitler, he starts to redeploy. Do the Brits then think that job done? How are they sure? They read the intercepts, they can tell that the Germans are sold. Does that become a euphoric situation in London? Do people think we've done our job, and we now need to think about our next deception operation? How does it land in London?
Well, I was lucky enough to interview two of the people, Jean Leslie and another of the MI5 secretaries, who were in the room, who were in room 13. The whole thing was plotted in this little subterranean. It's now a cloakroom, by the way, underneath the Admiralty. But then it was a sort of nerve centre of Operation Mincemeat, and they were in there. And when the Bletchley Park intercept came through, saying it's clear this has been swallowed, they all just shouted for joy and embraced each other. I think it was an incredibly moving moment. And the next message that came through came from Hitler, and it said, Operation Mincemeat swallowed rod, line, and sinker. So they really believed that it had changed. But you're right. There was no time to waste because, of course, the second front was going to open shortly in the west again. So they had to start plotting another deception for that one. And then
to tie up the last question before we do maybe some questions from the audience, what happened to Glyndwr Michael's body? What happened to the briefcase?
Well, the briefcase and its content. The briefcase has disappeared. The contents of the briefcase, those original pieces of paper, the wallet litter, are all in the National Archives in Britain. And one of the most moving elements of writing this book really was to be able to hold these kind of crinkly bits of paper that had been in the water in Spain, and actually hold the things that had been written on by Jean Leslie, handed to Montague. Chumley wore the uniform again. That's survived. So that was extraordinary, really. Yeah. So sorry, I've forgotten your question. What was it?
What happened to the body? What happened to Michael's
body?
Well,
okay. So yes, poor old Glyndwr Michael was buried in Huelva Cemetery under the name William Martin of the Royal Marines. And once the name was revealed by the British government in 1996, they added a sort of postscript to the gravestone, which reads, Glyndwr Michael served as William Martin of the Royal Marines. So they've acknowledged that the body in that grave is not the person who is named above it, it's somebody else. And I found that very moving because it sort of said to me that it's possible to be to take part in a war, to change human events in a way that is completely inadvertent. That you can be a warrior when you're already dead. And that was just such an extraordinary thought. And here was this man whose life had amounted to very little. I mean, poor Glyndwr Michael, he was homeless, he was an alcoholic, he was mentally ill, he had no family, he had nothing. But somehow he had played an absolutely pivotal part in one of the great moments of 20th century history.
Well, it's a spectacular book, Ben. I've been waiting to see the film. When I found out it was going to be played here, I'm so excited. I hope that...
By the way, it's a world premiere here.
Is that right?
Yeah. It's not been... I don't quite know how to explain this, but it hasn't really been released yet in India. So this is a sneak preview you're getting here.
I think that the key role when you do your next edition is the janitor who put the rat poison out that Glyndwr Michael ate. So whether the rat is the one who won in this story rather than... Anyway, it's a spectacular book. I mean, what you're so good at, Ben, is first of all finding these stories, working through National Archives that you've done on many, many other times with such distinction, and you write like a novelist, which is a real pleasure to read. It is a fantastically inspiring and interesting story, and I can't wait to see the film.